Hello everyone, this is Travis Wright with you again for the Bare Metal to Private Cloud series. Glad to have you back. Took a week off last week for TechEd North America. Hopefully some of you are able to attend that conference and learned lots of good things there at TechEd, and you're ready to get back to our series here. So today we're going to be taking the next step and installing and configuring Operations Manager. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. If you'll remember, in the previous sessions, we deployed all of the infrastructure. So we have a number of different virtual machines that we're now going to install on top of our infrastructure. So we've got these two VM hosts, and this is a clustered VM host using Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1. We're now going to, and last time we had set up Virtual Machine Manager and we had provisioned out a bunch of virtual machines on top of these two hosts. So we now have an OMMS1, OMMS2, SQL A, and SQL B. These are virtual machines that have been deployed out there. And ahead of time, I've installed SQL Server just using a standard SQL cluster deployment. Hopefully everybody knows how to do that. If not, there's information on how to do that on the web, of course, but very basic standard configuration there. And now what we're going to do is we're going to deploy Operations Manager in a highly available configuration so we can start to monitor not only the infrastructure that we've already deployed, but as we deploy more system-centered components like Service Manager, Orchestrator, and so on, as well as our own line of business applications, we can use Operations Manager to monitor those. So what we're going to do is we're going to install some components on these virtual machines. We're going to provision in a couple of additional databases. The database files for the data file and the log files will reside on specially created LUNs on the SAN. So we'll see that here in just a second. Okay, but first let's talk about a few concepts just to make sure everybody's on the same page. There are two databases for Operations Manager. The first one is called Operations Manager. That's the online database for Operations Manager, meaning that that's the database that the consoles are accessing, the information coming in from the monitored computers is being stored in that database. And then the second database is the Operations Manager Data Warehouse, and that's a different database that is used for offline and long-term storage, as well as that's the database that all of the reports run off, so that executing those reports doesn't impact the performance of the online database. Okay, now you could deploy these two different databases on separate SQL servers, and that would be good for very large deployments. In this particular deployment, we'll be deploying them on a single SQL Server instance. Okay, now the management server is the middle tier server for Operations Manager. And the management server is really comprised of just these three Windows services. The first one is the System Center Data Access Service, and that's a Windows service that exposes a WCF web service, and that web service is what the clients connect to. So a client in this sense could be either a Service Manager an Operations Manager console. It could be any sort of custom application that you wrote using SDK in Operations Manager, etc. So any sort of data access that's going to or from the Operations Manager database goes through this System Center Data Access Service web service. The next service is the System Center Management Service, and this is the workflow host. So any type of monitoring that we do or any workflows that we execute, this all happens in the security context of the management service. And that service on the management server is responsible for taking data in from the monitored computers and storing that data in the Operations Manager database. And then lastly, we have the System Center Configuration Management Service, which is used to calculate which workflows should be running where. So for example, it would determine that because this server over here has SQL Server on it, we're going to tell that the agent on that server to run certain rules or monitors to monitor the performance or health of that SQL Server. Now, management servers starting in System Center 2012 are deployed in a farm topology. So in previous versions of Operations Manager, we recommended using clustering for high availability. We've now removed what was called the root management server in the topology, and you can now just have a simple farm topology of management servers. So you can add additional management servers to increase the performance as you scale out, as well as provide for high availability by putting a Windows NLB or hardware load balancer in front of those management servers and having your consoles and other applications that are using the System Center Data Access Service to access that through the NLB or the hardware load balancer. So feel free to jump in at any time with questions in the tool there, and I'll answer them at a good stopping point here. Okay, now the next role in Operations Manager is the Web Console Server. The Web Console Server is a standard ASP.NET website that you install in IIS, and the user experience is delivered via Silverlight running in the browser. And that Silverlight control then talks back to the System Center Data Access Service to access the data and display it in the browser. So that's a fairly simple installation. And then the last component is the reporting server role, and that uses standard SQL reporting services. So we just install that on a SQL reporting services server, and the reports will be accessible through SQL reporting services. So with that, we're going to jump into a demo, but let's just pause here for just a minute and see if there's any questions. Okay, I don't see any coming in, so I'll go ahead now and share out my desktop. Okay. Now, in between the last time we got together and now, I've installed Windows 8 Release Preview, so you can see this video now running in my Windows 8 Video Metro app. All right, so give it just a second more to finish rendering here. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and play the video. And we're going to start out with configuring network load balancing. So here I'm going to show you how to set up a cluster to do network load balancing. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to start out in the Virtual Machine Manager console, and I'm going to configure the network for my OMMS1 and OMMS2 management servers so that they have an additional network adapter that will connect to the VM network. This will allow the two VMs that are running on the host to talk to each other over the VM network. And one thing that you'll notice here is I'm connecting to the VLAN that we had already provisioned in a previous session. And then a very important thing here is to enable spoofing of MAC addresses. This checkbox needs to be checked if you are using a network load balancing cluster inside of the VM. So make sure you check that off when you're doing this. Okay, now if you watch very closely here, when I configure the next virtual machine, you'll notice that I make an error. Let's see if anybody can spot it. Did you see it? What was the error? Just send in a comment if you notice what it was that I did wrong that time. All right, so now that we've got the networks configured, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start up the virtual machines. Okay, and now when I'm inside the virtual machines, I'm just going to label the network connections so that they're a little bit easier to identify. One is for management, which allows me to access these VMs from the corporate network, and the other one is the internal network that we're using for network load balancing. Okay, so just a simple rename there, make it a little easier. Now I'm going to fire up server management or server manager so we can install the network load balancing feature. Okay, so you can see I'm just doing this side by side on OMMS1 and OMMS2. I'm just installing the network load balancing feature. This is a quick installation. Okay, so once that's done, then we're going to fire up the network load balancing management console. And then we'll do this on both machines. And we'll configure the network load balancing. So first, on one of the management servers, doesn't really matter which one, we can create a new cluster. We'll type in the name of the host. In this case, this is the first management server. We choose the NLB network connection. And then we're going to assign a static IP address to that network connection. And here we're going to identify the IP address for the cluster. Again, this is a static IP address. Okay, and then we give the cluster a name. So in this case, I call it OMMS. And at that point, we're done creating the cluster on the first node. And now we go over to the second node and we connect to an existing cluster. So in this case, we'll point to the first node of the cluster, OMMS1. We'll connect to that. You can see it's got the right IP address. And then we add host to cluster. So first we connected, now we're adding OMMS2 to the cluster. We do the same thing. We select the NLB network connection. We assign it a static IP address. Okay, and we're done there. Okay, so that's really simple, easy to set up an NLB load balancer, and this will allow our consoles and other clients to access the data access service by going through the network load balancer. That way we can take management servers up and down for maintenance as needed. Now I'm going into Active Directory, and I'm going to create pointer records here inside of Active Directory. So I'm just creating an IP address record for each of the static IP addresses on each of the nodes of the cluster, as well as one for the cluster name itself. Okay, and then once this is all done, I'm just going to open up a command window and do a quick ping test to verify that each of the IP addresses is working fine. So it looks like everything's set up correctly. All right, now we're going to move on to installing Prerequisite software. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the window and we'll answer them. So the first thing we need to do to install Prerequisite software is to install some additional features. So we just go into Server Manager, and we have to do this on each of the nodes. We're going to install .NET Framework 3.5.1. And when we do this, there's going to be some specific role services that we have to add. And this is listed in the Operations Manager documentation, or of course you can refer to this video. But I'm just going to go down the list and check off those that are required to install Operations Manager. Now, the Operations Manager setup also has a prerequisite checker in it that will check to make sure that each of these role services are added. And if they aren't, it will prevent you from installing Operations Manager and tell you what's missing. Okay, so simple. Done with that. All right, so that's installing the features. Now we need to do some IIS configuration changes. In this case, what we need to do is we need to enable some ISAPI and CGI restrictions. So we go into IIS, we select the Operations Manager MS2, like the OMMS2 website here. Okay, now you'll notice right here that there's no 4.0 ISAPI extensions yet. So to do that, I have to install .NET Framework 4.0. So you just download this from the web, install .NET Framework 4.0, and you'll notice that after we install this, that you'll see some additional ISAPI restrictions available in here. Okay, so refresh that, and you'll see that those two show up now, and we're going to allow both of them. Okay, and then you also need to download and install the report viewer control. This one's a real fast install. The report viewer control is used to view reports, obviously, inside of the main console. Okay, so at this point, we're ready to install the Operations Manager management server. So we'll install the management server first on OMMS1, and you'll notice here that I was pointing out that on DC1, I have created 3 new Active Directory accounts. So in this case, I've got OM Data Reader, OM Data Writer, and OMMS Action. So I've just created standard user accounts in Active Directory, and now I'm also going to configure SSL inside of IIS. We'll just go in here and we'll add an HTTPS site binding. And on port 443, select an SSL certificate. In this case, I did a self-signed certificate, but you could get one from a certificate authority. And then change your SSL settings to require SSL. Now, it's not necessary to run SSL. It's really just sort of a best practice in order to improve security by encrypting the data on the wire. So now I'm launching the Operations Manager setup. I'm selecting the Management Server, Operations Console, and Web Console components. Choose an installation directory. And now we're choosing a management group name. Now, a management group name is simply a name that uniquely identifies an installation of Operations Manager. And by installation of Operations Manager here, what I'm referring to is an Operations Manager database, an Operations Manager data warehouse database, some number of management servers, some number of agents that are out there that are installed on computers that you're managing, as well as other roles that Operations Manager has, like the report server role, gateway servers, etc. All of that together is what we call a management group. And here we're just providing a friendly name for that. It can be anything you want. So I just called it OM, agree to the licensing. And here we're going to point to the SQL cluster that I created, and we're going to use the SQL cluster name. So we want to connect not just one of the specific nodes of the cluster, but to the cluster name. And now what I'm doing here is I'm showing you that I've created specific LUNs on the SAN that are for the Operations Manager database file and the log file, and I've presented those to the SQL server. And now I'm telling the Operations Manager setup which LUN to use by pointing to the logical drives corresponding to those LUNs. Now I'm repeating the same thing for the Operations Manager data warehouse databases, or database. So we have a data LUN for that, as well as a log file LUN for it. Okay, and here we're going to choose which website we want to install it on. Check off we want to enable SSL. Here we can choose, on that previous screen it was asking you whether you wanted to use mixed mode authentication or only Windows authentication. So if you want people to be able to access the web console using a prompt to capture the credentials, then you use mixed mode authentication. If you want it to be only Windows integrated authentication, then choose that option. Now here on this screen I'm configuring the different accounts for Operations Manager. So the Management Server Action account is the account that is used to execute all the workflows on the Operations Manager server. So in this case, I recommend using a domain account. So in this case, I'm going to use the user account that I created in Active Directory previously that I pointed out, and Operations Manager setup will take care of provisioning all the necessary permissions on this local management server for that action account to do what it needs to do. The other accounts are the System Center Configuration Service and System Center Data Access Service. Here you have an option of using either local system or a domain account. if you use a domain account, then you have to worry about updating the password, which is fine. If you're using Operations Manager where you've got one management server and an untrusted domain separate from the Operations Manager database server, you'll need to use the domain account. Otherwise, you have to worry about setting up spins and that kind of thing. So in this case, just for ease of deployment, I chose local system, and that'll add the local computer account into the Operations Manager database with the right permissions. Okay, and then here's the data reader account. What we use to read data out of the database. And I actually use these accounts backwards. You can see that I put in data right there, and I put data read down here, but it doesn't really matter. They're just Active Directory accounts. Okay, and here we choose to opt in or opt out of Customer Experience Improvement Program, as well as error reporting, enable Microsoft Update, and install. So obviously I've sped this up so we don't have to sit here and wait for things. Now, one thing you'll note here is you no longer need to back up the encryption key, so that's not necessary. And now what I'm doing is I'm installing the components now on the second management server. So I'm checking off the same components here, and there'll be a slightly different user experience that you'll see here in just a second. So in this case, instead of creating a new management group, we're going to add this management server to an existing management group. To do that, we point at the SQL server that hosts our database that we've already installed and select it. And we do the same thing here, enable SSL for the website, and this time we just need to provide the management server action account. Okay, same thing with customer experience improvement, error reporting, Microsoft Update, all that's the same. Okay, so at this point we now have a clustered management server in the sense that it's a network load balancer in front of our two management servers, right? It's not an actual Windows cluster. Okay, now we're going to install reporting. Now to install reporting, what I've done in this case, and you can scale this out if you want to, but in this case what I've done is I've installed SQL reporting services on the SQL server that's hosting all of my databases for System Center. So you can set it up that way. You can also set it up where the SQL reporting services is on a separate server from where you're running the database engine hosting the databases. So if you have a large deployment of Operations Manager, I recommend scaling this out, having a separate SQL reporting services server. If you already have a SQL reporting services server farm, then you can deploy the Operations Manager functionality onto that farm as well. So kind of depends on what your current topology is for reporting purposes. Lots of flexibility there. So here we're checking out just the report server, and we're going to specify which management server we should connect to. In this case, we just provide one of the management server names here. And we specify which SQL Server instance we want to deploy onto. And we specify the data reader account. And this has to be the same account that we specified earlier when we set up the first management server. Okay, opt into operational data reporting. Now, operational data reporting is a feature in Operations Manager that if you opt into it, will anonymously send data to Microsoft that tells us how the management packs in Operations Manager are performing. So it tells us what are the most common alerts that happen. What is the quantity of data being collected by these different management packs and so on. And that helps us tune our management packs so that we are if we're alerting too often or not often enough, or if we're collecting too much data or not enough data, we can tune those management packs based upon the data that's being sent to us anonymously from customers that opt into this program. There's no identifiable information that's sent in these operational data reports, but it also helps us identify what are some of the most common problems that happen with Microsoft or any other applications being monitored by Operations Manager. So that can help us identify, we've had this problem happening in Exchange a lot, for example, and we can go and talk to the Exchange team and say, hey, you guys have this problem happening a lot, you guys need to do something about it. Okay, so here we're going to opt into Microsoft Update, and we're done installing the reporting server component of Operations Manager. And in this case, I have SQL reporting services set up in a cluster on the SQL cluster. And so I would repeat this exact same procedure on the other node of the cluster so that I then have a clustered reporting services capability as well. So then I have highly available reporting. So with that, we've now deployed 2 Operations Manager management servers. And we have also deployed the website as well. And we have deployed the report server component onto the SQL reporting services. So at this point, we have a fully deployed Operations Manager infrastructure, and that will enable us to kind of take the next step, which would be to start deploying out agents to the machines that we want to manage, whether they're the infrastructure machines like the VM hosts, or the virtual machine manager servers, or our SQL servers, or the file servers that we deployed earlier on, or if we have line of business application servers and so on, we can start to deploy out the agents to those and start monitoring the infrastructure applications and server components from Microsoft, as well as line of business applications. So let's see. I think that's all I wanted to cover today. So let me just take a couple questions here. Let's see. We've got a few in the hopper here. Okay, first question is, when would you expect us to use the Unified Installer? So just a little background for those that aren't familiar. The Unified Installer is a downloadable solution from Microsoft. It doesn't cost anything. But it's basically a set of runbooks that you import into Orchestrator, and there's like a user experience that you walk through, kind of a wizard that prompts you for various information about how you want to deploy System Center, and that information is then fed into this runbook, and the runbooks will take care of installing System Center for you on the servers that you indicate in the wizard. So that's great for scenarios like a proof of concept, where you just want to get System Center up and going quickly, or maybe for, maybe you're building out like a demo lab or something like that, if you're going to a conference, things like that. Now, it's not designed for a highly available production deployment of System Center. There's a lot of variables that go into deploying System Center in a production configuration where you want to have high availability. You want to think about how many management servers do I need, how many, and setting up the connections between the components of the System Center suite and so on. So, I'd recommend it just for proof of concepts or demo labs or development labs or something along those lines, but not for production deployment. Okay, the next question is, will all sessions be available for downloads? I don't know if they're available for download, but they are up on the web. I would think they'd be available for download. Within about 24 hours or so, they are available at the same place that you registered and came into the session today. There is a blog post out, I'll share that out here in just a second, that lists all of the links for that. Okay, so let me just look that up while I'm answering these other questions. In fact, if you just search for bare metal to private cloud, it'll be the first link, I think. Yeah, just search for bare metal to private cloud, and it's the first link there. Okay, next question. Why did you install this in NLB mode if SCOM 2012 now uses resource pool spread on many management servers? Okay, so new in Operations Manager 2012 is the concept of a resource pool. Resource pools are used for agents to connect to management servers. And you can create a resource pool that says, these agents over here are allowed to connect to any management server in this resource pool. So that provides for some fault tolerance in terms of the agents being able to talk to the management servers, but that does not address the notion of having highly available connections for clients like an Operations Manager console or the web servers or and so on. So you do need to set up NLB for those client connections. Okay. What do you recommend for the SQL disk configuration? Like how many drives, what speed, logs, etc. Okay, so a few recommendations here. I did talk about this a little bit in one of our previous sessions, but it really just comes down to the size of your deployment of System Center. If it's a small deployment, you really don't need any more than one logical drive. I run, I've got 8 VMs on my laptop here, and each of those VMs is running on one of 2 physical drives in my laptop, and it's fine. And each of those, and I have one SQL Server VM, and all of the data and log files for all of System Center are all inside of that one VHD and running on one logical drive. So for a demo type of environment or development type of environment, you can certainly get away with having one drive for everything. If you're going to a production deployment and you have a very large production deployment, then I would recommend having separate data and log file LUNs on a SAN so that it's more dynamic. You can add more spindles to the LUNs if needed. You can have different RAID configurations for the log file drives, which I recommend RAID 1 there, versus the data drives where you could have RAID 5, or if you've got lots of money, you could do RAID 10. And if you spread it out onto these separate LUNs, then you have a lot more flexibility about how you tune the data access. So it really just kind of comes down to that, and you'll just need to kind of work with your DBA to figure out what the optimal configuration is there. Obviously the faster the drives, the better. Usually I see people use 15K SAS drives in their SANs for storing production SQL Server data and log files. If you've got SSDs, that's even better, but I don't think it's really required for any of the components in System Center. All right, when you start to build your private cloud, is OM the first component that should be installed before the other System Center components? So in a clean deployment of a private cloud, it doesn't really matter which component you install first, other than I would recommend deploying Virtual Machine Manager first, because it allows you to get your fabric all set up. You can start to manage hosts, and as you saw in the previous session, it makes it a lot easier to provision the virtual machines that you'll then install the rest of the System Center components in. So you could install Service Manager first, you could install Orchestrator first, you could install Ops Manager first. It doesn't really matter which order you do it in after installing Virtual Machine Manager. Now, if you're going to do physical deployments of the System Center components, then you don't need to deploy Virtual Machine Manager first. Or if you're using something like VMware vCenter instead of using Virtual Machine Manager, then obviously you don't need to install Virtual Machine Manager first in that case. So you really can install it in any order. Okay, and then there's a question of, is there a maximum number of MPs you can have imported into Operations Manager? There's not a technical limit. You can install as many MPs as you want. But what I would say is that there's a practical limit of how much a given agent can do, and it also can potentially impact the workloads that are running on a server where an agent is running. So I've seen poorly written management packs which will collect a performance counter sample every second on every computer that is being managed, and you'll have a massive amount of data coming into the Operations Manager database, and it'll definitely impact the performance of Operations Manager, potentially kind of saturate your network, those types of things. So it really kind of comes down to which management packs you're importing, how well they're written, that type of thing. So you could have hundreds of really small management packs, or you could have 10 really big management packs, and there's everything in between. So It really kind of comes down to what you're managing, but I've never seen somebody have too many management packs that are, good quality management packs. I've never seen the system be overwhelmed by having too many management packs that are of high quality. Okay, so we've reached the bottom of the barrel here on the questions. I'll wait just a minute more to see if there's any other questions that come into the queue. Okay, and meanwhile, I'll go back to the PowerPoint presentation here. So the next step in our private cloud journey here is we're going to deploy and configure Service Manager, and that session will be on Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific time, and I look forward to seeing you then. And then we'll have the last two sessions of the series next week on Tuesday and Thursday, also at 11 a.m. Pacific. And just let me share out the link to all of the webcast series here. Hopefully everybody can see this. So that's where you can go if you want to see the calendar of these webcasts and where to go to either view them in retrospective or for the upcoming webcasts later this week and next week. Okay, thank you everyone for joining, and as always, you can follow up with me on email or through Twitter if you have any follow-up questions. Otherwise, we'll see you on Thursday.